I found out on a Sunday, which feels important for some reason. Like the universe has a sixth sense of irony about ruining the one day you're supposed to have peace. I'd come home early from my mom's place because Marcus had texted saying he wasn't feeling well and I wanted to check on him. I picked up soup from the Thai place he likes. I was being a good wife. I was doing the thing. And I walked into my own house and heard sounds from upstairs that stopped me at the bottom of the staircase, like someone had pressed pause on my entire body. I stood there holding a plastic bag of takeout and I told myself it was the TV. I told myself he'd fallen asleep with a movie on. I told myself about 12 different things in the span of about 4 seconds, and then I walked up the stairs anyway because I think some part of me already knew and was done pretending. The bedroom door wasn't fully closed. It was open just enough that I could see everything I needed to see. Marcus was there. And next to him, in my bed, with her hair down and her shoes on the floor next to his shoes, was my sister Kayla. They didn't see me immediately. I had about 3 full seconds of standing there before either of them noticed, and in those 3 seconds, I had a thought so clear and strange, it almost felt calm, which was simply, oh, so this is what it feels like. Let me back up, because if I just tell you what I saw without telling you who these people were to me, then you won't understand why this specific combination of people is the thing that broke something in me that I'm still trying to repair. Marcus and I had been married for 4 years when this happened. We'd been together for 2 years before that. 6 years total, the kind of time where you stop thinking of someone as a person you chose and start thinking of them as just part of the architecture of your life, the same way you stop noticing the furniture in a room you've lived in long enough. He was funny and quiet in equal measure, the kind of man who remembered small things, the coffee order, the name of your coworker's dog, the anniversary of something you mentioned once. That quality had made me feel so seen when we were dating, and I think I spent 6 years confusing being remembered with being truly known. Kayla is 3 years younger than me. She's always been the louder one, the one who fills a room faster, the one my parents worried less about because she seemed to move through the world more easily than I did. We were close in the way sisters who grow up sharing everything become close, which is a specific kind of intimacy that has nothing to do with choosing each other and everything to do with surviving the same household and deciding, somewhere along the way, that you prefer each other's company to most other people's. She was my maid of honor. I need you to sit with that for a second. She stood 3 feet from me on the day I married this man, and she held my flowers, and she cried during the vows, and afterwards she gave a speech that made everyone at the reception laugh and then get quiet in that way where you can feel the room actually feeling something. And she talked about how Marcus was the first person she'd ever seen make me slow down, how he made me less afraid of being still. And I stood there listening to my little sister describe my husband and thought she understood us better than almost anyone. She was at our apartment every other weekend. She came on vacation with us twice. She called Marcus when she had car trouble because his number was faster to find than a mechanic's. I told her things about my marriage that I haven't told anyone else. The arguments, the stretches where things felt flat and distant, the times I wondered if we'd gotten too comfortable too fast. I told her those things because she was my sister, and that's what sisters are for. I understand now that I was handing her a map of every crack in my marriage, and she was studying it, which is a thought I have to put down sometimes, because if I hold it too long, it does something to me that I don't have a name for yet. The clues were there, and I missed every single one. And I've decided to stop punishing myself for that because you don't look for something you have no reason to believe exists. But I can see them now, laid out in retrospect like a trail I was walking backward the whole time. The first thing that should have registered was about 14 months before the Sunday with the soup. Marcus started going to the gym in the mornings instead of evenings. I thought nothing of it. People changed their routines. I was happy he was being consistent about it. I even told Kayla once that he'd been doing better about taking care of himself. She said, "Yeah, I know." And I thought she meant she'd noticed when she saw him. I didn't think about the fact that she'd said it with a kind of platness that meant she wasn't receiving new information. Then there was the texting. Marcus is not a big texter. He's the kind of person who will see a message and not respond for 2 hours, not because he's ignoring you, but because he just genuinely forgets responding is a thing he needs to do. I'd accepted this about him years ago, so when I noticed he was suddenly more attentive to his phone, I thought he'd just gotten better at it. I even thought it was nice. I might have mentioned it to Kayla. I think she said something like, "He's probably just trying to be more present." And I think I agreed with her. The thing about Kayla specifically that made her the perfect person to be hiding this from me is that she was also the person I would have gone to if I'd been suspicious. She was my sounding board. Every paranoid thought I had, every slight anxiety I felt about my marriage went to her first before it went anywhere else. There was a night about 10 months before the Sunday where I'd found a text on Marcus's phone from a number I didn't recognize. Just a vague thing, something like, "Miss you today." And my stomach dropped, and I stood in the kitchen holding his phone for about 30 seconds before he came in and saw me. He said it was a colleague going through a hard time, that she'd gotten emotionally attached in a way that was uncomfortable, and he was trying to manage it professionally. And the explanation was so specific and so calm that I believed him. And the first person I called afterwards was Kayla. And she said, "That sounds like Marcus. That sounds exactly like the kind of awkward situation he'd end up in because he's too nice to shut things down early." And I said, "Well, you're right." And that was the end of it. She was so good. She was incredibly good at this. She had 8 years of knowing how I think and what I need to hear, and she used every single bit of that to keep me exactly where they needed me to be. I want to pause here and ask you something, genuinely, because I've gone back and forth on this myself. At what point does a person become responsible for not seeing what's in front of them? I've talked to people who say they would have known sooner, and maybe they would have. Or maybe they just think they would have, because the alternative is accepting that any of us can be completely fooled by the two people we trust the most. I'm genuinely curious what you would have done differently, because I have gone through every moment of those 14 months, and I cannot find the place where I had enough real information to know. What I had was feelings I talked myself out of, because the person I used to talk them through with was one of the people causing them. Let me know what you think in the comments, seriously. And then let's get back to this because we're not even at the worst part yet. There was a period of about 3 weeks, maybe 8 months before everything collapsed, where Kayla was unusually distant from me. She canceled plans twice in a row, she was shorter on the phone than usual, she didn't come over the weekend she normally came over, and when I mentioned it, she said she was just overwhelmed with work and needed some space. And I gave her space because that's what you do for someone you love when they ask for it. Marcus was also slightly distant during that same period, but separately. I never connected the two distances because why would I? They were different people with different things going on. That's what I told myself. What I understand now is that they were probably pulling back from both of us simultaneously because something had shifted in what they were doing and they were recalibrating, managing the exposure, adjusting how much proximity to either of us was safe. The distance wasn't them needing space from the world, it was them needing space from the specific risk of being around me and around each other in the same room and having to perform normal while whatever they were doing had gotten more serious. I found a text later, during the evidence phase, where Kayla had written to him that she felt sick every time she looked at me, and he'd written back, "I know, me too." And whether that sick feeling was guilt or just the inconvenience of maintaining a lie, I still don't know, and I've decided it doesn't matter. The night before the Sunday I found them, I was at Kayla's apartment. We'd had dinner, just the two of us, wine and pasta, and the kind of conversation that wanders between small topics without landing anywhere in particular, the comfortable kind. And at one point, she'd looked at me across the table with this expression I couldn't read, and I'd asked her what, and she'd said nothing, just, "I love you, you know that." And I'd said, "I know, I love you too." And we'd clink glasses and moved on. I have thought about that moment more times than I can count. I have turned it over and looked at it from every angle, trying to determine if it was guilt or a goodbye or just a sister telling her sister something true in the middle of a lie. And I think it was probably all three at once, which is the kind of complexity that makes people, and specifically Kayla, very hard to write off cleanly. She wasn't a cartoon. She wasn't performing it badly. She was a real person doing a terrible thing with enough genuine love still mixed in to make the terrible thing more terrible, not less. I went home from her apartment that night and kissed Marcus on the cheek and went to bed and slept fine, which feels impossible now, but was just true. And in the morning, I drove to my mom's and then came home early with soup because he said he wasn't feeling well. And that is the whole chain of ordinary events that ended on a staircase. Back to the staircase. I stood there for 3 seconds, and then the door was fully open, and Marcus saw me first. And I watched his face do a thing I had never seen it do before, which was go completely blank. Not guilty, not panicked, just blank. Like every expression he owned suddenly left at the same time, and what was left underneath was nothing I recognized. Kayla made a sound, something between a word and not a word, and I looked at her, and she looked at me, and for a moment we were just sisters, looking at each other across a bedroom, and all the complexity of what we were to each other was fully present in that look. The shared childhood, the fights, the inside jokes, the thousands of hours, the maid of honor speech, all of it. And then I looked down at the soup bag in my hand, and I set it very carefully on the floor outside the bedroom door, which I know sounds strange, but in that moment it felt important not to drop it. And then I turned around and walked back down the stairs and out the front door and got in my car and drove to the parking lot of a grocery store 2 miles away and sat there for 2 hours. I didn't call anyone. I didn't cry right away. I just sat there in the parking lot with the engine off and watched people push carts in and out of the automatic doors and tried to figure out what to do with the rest of my life. Marcus called 11 times during those 2 hours. Kayla called 4 times and then stopped. I didn't answer any of them. I didn't have anything to say yet, or more accurately, I had too much to say and no way to say it that wouldn't just be sound, just noise, just the kind of raw expression that doesn't actually communicate anything and only leaves you more exhausted. I've always been someone who needs to understand something before I respond to it, and I didn't understand anything yet. I just had one image on a loop and a bag of soup on a hallway floor and the sound Kayla had made when she saw me, and none of that was enough to build a response from. When I finally drove home, they were both gone. The bed had been remade, which made me so angry I had to leave the room immediately, as if whoever had made it thought tidiness was some kind of solution, as if straightening the sheets was a gesture that would undo or soften what had happened in them. I went through the house and I looked at things. I looked at the photo on the mantle from our wedding with Kayla standing next to me in the bridesmaid dress she'd chosen herself because I told her to pick whatever made her feel beautiful. I looked at the coffee mug Marcus uses every morning. I looked at the kitchen table where the three of us had eaten dinner together approximately 100 times, and I thought about what any of those dinners actually were. I went through his phone that night. He'd left it on the charger in the kitchen, which was either deliberate or careless. And I stood there and went through it for an hour and a half. The thread with Kayla went back 19 months. 19 months! I've been through a lot of math in my adult life, but none of it hit me the way that number did. 19 months is not a mistake. 19 months is not a moment of weakness that got out of hand. 19 months is a relationship. It has seasons in it. It has Christmases in it. There were 2 Christmases in 19 months, 2 Christmas dinners where we all sat together at my parents' table, and in the weeks before both of them, there were messages between Marcus and Kayla about how to handle being in the same room, how to act normal, who would arrive first, when it would be safe to exchange a look and when it wouldn't. They had logistics, they had a system, they had a private language built out of emoji combinations that I wouldn't have decoded on my own, but that in context became obvious. Certain responses that meant I can't talk right now, and others that meant tonight. And they'd been using it for over a year. I sat on the kitchen floor, which seems to be where I do my worst thinking, and I read backward through 19 months of a relationship I didn't know existed, and I tried to figure out which version of my life had been real. Because here is what 19 months covers, just so you understand the scope of it. 19 months before the Sunday covers the trip Marcus and I took to Portugal for our 3rd anniversary, which I considered one of the best weeks of my marriage. We were so good on that trip, easy and warm and present with each other in a way that felt like a reset. We came home and I told Kayla all about it, and she listened with what I now understand was a very specific kind of attention. 19 months covers the period when I had a health scare that turned out to be nothing, but was terrifying for about 3 weeks. And Kayla came over and sat with me in the waiting room and held my hand, and Marcus was there too. And all 3 of us were in that waiting room, and 2 of them were already 6 months into whatever this was. 19 months covers my birthday, my work promotion, a fight Marcus and I had about money that I considered one of our worst, and which I apparently told Kayla about in enough detail that I can now see in the messages where she used what I said in confidence to navigate an affair with my husband. She took my own words and turned them into tools, and I handed them to her willingly because I thought she was on my side. She was always on her own side. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, I had a clearer idea of what I was dealing with, which is that this wasn't something I could process alone, and also not something I was ready to bring to my family yet, because bringing it to my family meant saying out loud that my husband and my sister had been together for 19 months, and once I said that out loud to my mother, the shape of everything would change permanently, and I needed a few more hours of everything not being permanently changed. I called my friend Dana instead, because Dana is the kind of person who can receive devastating information without it immediately becoming about how the information makes her feel, which is rarer than it sounds. I told her everything. She was quiet for a long time, and then she said, "Do you want me to come over?" And I said, "Yes." And she came over, and we sat at my kitchen table, and she didn't say anything that started with "at least" or "everything happens for a reason," which is all I needed from her, and which she delivered perfectly. She asked what I needed, and I said I didn't know yet, and she said, "Okay, we can figure that out." I have thought about Dana more warmly since that morning than I have about almost anyone else in the story because basic human decency looks enormous in contrast to what the other people in my life had been doing. Marcus came back to the house around noon. He knocked on the door of his own home, which told me that on some level, he understood that his standing in it had changed. I let him in, and we sat at the kitchen table, and I let him talk first because I wanted to hear what version of this he was going to offer me. What he offered was an apology that was technically complete in its components, but emotionally hollow in its delivery, the kind of apology that covers the surface of a thing without touching the thing. He said he was sorry. He said he hadn't meant for it to happen. He said it had started as nothing and grown into something he didn't know how to stop. I listened to all of it, and then I asked him 2 questions. The first was, how long? And he said he thought 9 months, which I already knew was wrong by 10 months, but I let it sit. The second question was whether he loved her, and he went very still for a moment before he said, "I don't know." And that answer told me more than anything he'd said before it, because the answer, if it was no, would have come immediately, and the pause before "I don't know" is where the truth lives. I told him he needed to leave the house for a few days. He didn't argue, which was the most respectful thing he did in that entire conversation. He packed a bag and left, and I sat at the table alone and started making the decisions
I
that would
did not
define the
call
next
Kayla.
year
I
of my
want to be
life.
clear about that choice. It wasn't that I had nothing to say to her. I had an enormous amount to say to her, but I understood that if I called her in those first 48 hours, I would be giving her access to my emotional state in real time, and she had already demonstrated what she was willing to do with access to my emotional state. So I held it. I sat with it. I let it be a thing I was carrying rather than a thing I was expressing. And that sounds stoic, but it was mostly just strategic because I needed to know what I was dealing with before I handed her any more of myself. What I did instead was talk to a lawyer, just to understand my options, just to have the shape of the terrain in my head before any decisions were made. The lawyer was professional and brief and completely unsurprised by anything I said, which I found both comforting and depressing in equal measure. I also went back through the messages more carefully because the first pass had been about chronology, and I needed to go through them again for content, for specifics, for understanding what the actual nature of this thing had been. And on the second pass, I found something that changed the frame of the entire story, something I hadn't seen the first time because I hadn't been looking for it. And that thing is what I need to get to eventually. But first, I need to tell you how the family found out. My mother found out on a Thursday, 5 days after the Sunday. I hadn't told her. What happened was that Kayla told her, or at least told her a version of it, which I only discovered after my mother called me in tears, saying she couldn't believe this was happening, and her tone had something in it that wasn't quite aligned with what I expected. There was grief in it, but not the grief I was anticipating. It was a more complicated grief. And when I pressed her, she told me that Kayla had called her the day before and told her that she and Marcus had feelings for each other and that something had happened and she was devastated about it. She told my mother this was a single incident that got out of control. She told my mother she was sick with guilt. She framed herself as someone who'd made a catastrophic mistake rather than someone who'd spent 19 months carefully maintaining a second relationship with her sister's husband. And my mother, who loves Kayla deeply and who was hearing this for the first time, and who had not yet seen the messages, responded with the instinct to protect her younger daughter, which is the instinct she has always had. And that was the moment I understood that this wasn't just about Marcus and Kayla anymore. This was about to become a family war, and I needed to be ready for that. I went to my parents' house that Friday with my phone, and I showed my mother the messages. I showed her the dates. I showed her the logistics conversations before Christmas dinners. I showed her the one where Kayla used something I'd told her in confidence to navigate a conversation with Marcus. My mother sat at her kitchen table and read through it all in silence, and by the end, she was crying in a way I hadn't seen her cry in years, not for herself, or not only for herself, but for what she was watching her family become in real time. My father was in the other room and didn't come in during that conversation because my parents have a dynamic where difficult emotional territory belongs to my mother first and my father processes later, which meant I had to have this conversation again with him the following morning. Slightly more composure on everyone's side, but the same information, the same dates, the same evidence. He said very little. He asked if I was okay in a way that made it clear he understood I wasn't and was asking anyway. Then he said he needed some time to think about what he was going to say to Kayla, and I told him to take whatever time he needed because I wasn't going anywhere. The family was fracturing in the way families fracture under this kind of pressure, which is not along clean lines, but along old fault lines, old loyalties, old patterns of who protected whom and who got the benefit of which doubt. Before I get to the twist, let me tell you about the subscription thing because it matters for the ending. If you're watching this and you haven't subscribed yet, do that now because the stories we put out every week aren't always announced ahead of time, and some of the best ones only reach you if you're already following. Okay, back to the family. My mother's sister, my Aunt Linda, took Kayla's side early and loudly, which hurt in a way I hadn't prepared for because Linda and I had always been close. But Linda and Kayla had always been close too, and I think Linda's instinct was to protect the person who reached her first with the most sympathetic version of events, which was again Kayla, who had spent the week after the Sunday making phone calls and telling her version to as many family members as she could reach before I'd said anything to anyone. By the time I started talking, Kayla had already planted the narrative in 5 or 6 family relationships, and narrative that gets there first is very difficult to dislodge even with evidence because people don't like changing their minds once they've decided how to feel about something. It was like watching a room drain of oxygen before you arrived. I was angry about it, and I was also grudgingly impressed because it required a level of strategic thinking that I had never fully attributed to Kayla, which in retrospect was consistent with 19 months of careful, sustained deception. She was good at managing information. She had been practicing on me for a long time. Now the twist, and I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you reorganized everything I thought I knew, not just about the affair, but about the timeline and the intention behind it. On the second pass through Marcus's messages, I found a thread that wasn't with Kayla. It was with a number I didn't recognize. And in that thread, dated about 6 months before Kayla and Marcus apparently started whatever they were doing, Marcus had a conversation with someone about me, about my marriage, about whether I was happy, about what I wanted long term. The person he was talking to was asking the kinds of questions someone asks when they're trying to understand the vulnerabilities of a situation, not the questions a friend asks about a friend, but the kind of targeted questions you ask when you're gathering information with a purpose. I didn't recognize the number at first. I ran it through a few things, and then I found it. And when I found it, I sat very still for a long time. The number belonged to a woman named Jess who worked in Kayla's office. Kayla had asked someone she knew to reach out to my husband under a separate identity to feel out the state of my marriage 6 months before they started what they started. And Marcus had talked to this person openly because he thought it was just someone he'd met at an event who was being friendly. Kayla had done reconnaissance. She had planned this. This was not a moment of weakness that grew into something she couldn't control. This was a decision she
I
made
need to
and
tell
then
you what
worked
that information
backward
did to
from.
me because it's important. It removed the last piece of ambiguity I'd been unconsciously holding on to, the small part of me that had been trying to understand this as a human failing rather than a human choice. Everyone can understand a failing. We've all failed at things we cared about, let something grow that we should have pruned, let feelings exist that we should have redirected. That's human, and it's forgivable, eventually. Not immediately, but eventually. What I was looking at in that message thread was not a failing. It was architecture. She had built this deliberately from a foundation she laid 6 months before the first message between them, and she had used her knowledge of me to identify the right moment and the right angle and the right approach, and she had executed it with the kind of patience that means you want the thing badly enough to wait for it. I don't know what she wanted exactly, whether it was Marcus specifically or just the specific power of taking something of mine, and I've thought about that question a lot and landed on the conclusion that it doesn't actually matter which one it was, because the outcome is identical and my response to it would be the same either way.
What I knew now was that there was nothing to save between us, not because of what she'd done, but because of who she revealed herself to be while doing it. The Kayla I'd had a sister with was not the whole Kayla. I'd been loving a partial picture. I confronted her. Not immediately, not while I was still raw with the new information, but about 2 weeks after the Sunday. I asked her to meet me at a coffee shop because I wanted to be somewhere public where neither of us would make the kind of noise that neighbors call someone about. She came in looking the way people look when they've been sleeping badly, smaller than usual, quieter in the way she held herself, and I watched her settle into the chair across from me and order something and wrap her hands around the cup, and I thought about the dinner we'd had 2 nights before the Sunday, where she'd told me she loved me and meant some part of it. I told her I knew about Jess. I told her I knew about the reconnaissance. I watched her face, and she didn't try to deny it, which was the only decent thing she did in that entire conversation. She said she knew I would find it eventually. She said she'd tried to stop the whole thing multiple times. She said a lot of things that were technically true in isolation and collectively meaningless, and I let her say all of them, because I wasn't there to argue, I was there to tell her something. And when she finished, I told her very quietly that I needed her to understand that I wasn't angry at her for wanting something she wanted. I was finished with her for choosing to take it the way she did, and that those two things were not the same, and that she should take some time to understand the difference before she tried to contact me again. Then I paid for my own coffee and left. The divorce took 8 months. I'm not going to walk through all of it because it's both too much and not enough at the same time. Too many details that blur together into paperwork and phone calls, and one very difficult mediation session where Marcus said things that I think he believed were true about what had gone wrong between us. Some of which were accurate, and some of which were the kind of revisionist history people construct to make themselves feel less culpable. The marriage was not perfect before Kayla. I want to be honest about that. There were real distances between us, real places where we'd stopped reaching for each other with the same intention we'd started with, and I can hold that as true without it becoming an explanation for what he chose to do. Because people in imperfect marriages make choices every day not to do what he did, and the existence of a crack in a marriage is not an invitation for someone to widen it on purpose.
We have no
He moved
kids, no
across the
shared
city.
property beyond the house, which I kept, which felt important in a way that was maybe partly practical and partly about the need to not be displaced from my own life on top of everything else. I repainted the bedroom, I replaced the mattress, I moved the furniture into different positions and lived with the strangeness of the new arrangement until it became normal, and then it was just my room and I could be in it again. My relationship with my family took longer to stabilize than my relationship with my own house. My mother landed fully on my side by the end of the first month, once she'd had time to process what she'd read and talk to my father and reach her own conclusions, separate from the first emotional response Kayla had triggered. My father had a conversation with Kayla that I wasn't present for and that he has never fully described to me, only said it was the hardest conversation he'd ever had with her and that he made certain things clear. My Aunt Linda softened over time, not enough to admit she'd been wrong about her initial positioning, but enough to stop actively reinforcing Kayla's narrative in family spaces. The cousins sorted themselves without much drama. The family friends mostly fell where they fell without too much input from me because by a certain point I stopped having the energy to manage other people's perceptions of the situation and decided that the people who needed evidence to believe me weren't people whose belief I needed. That sounds like something a person says to make themselves feel better about a painful situation, and it is, a little, but it's also genuinely true, and sometimes things are both at once. Kayla and I have not spoken since the coffee shop. It's been 14 months. My mother talks to her separately, and I've told my mother that's her right and her relationship, and I'm not going to ask her to choose, which is both true and one of the harder things I've had to mean. I don't know what Kayla's life looks like now. I don't know if she's still in contact with Marcus or whether that thing dissolved once it was no longer secret, because in my experience, things that are built on secrecy often lose their shape when the secrecy is removed. The intensity was always partly about the hiding rather than the having, and once there's nothing left to hide, the whole structure sometimes just collapses from the inside. I hope it did. That's probably not generous of me, but it's honest, and I've decided to prioritize honesty over generosity about this particular thing. What I've been thinking about most in the 14 months since is not actually the affair itself anymore. I spent the first several months thinking about the affair constantly, turning it over, reprocessing memories, doing the retroactive math on moments I now understood differently. And at a certain point, that process just stopped being useful and started being a way of staying attached to pain that had stopped teaching me anything new. What I think about now is the thing underneath it, which is the question of what you actually know about the people you love. Not what you've been told, not the version of them that shows up to dinners and holds your hand in waiting rooms and gives speeches at your wedding, but the actual complete person with all the rooms you've never been shown. I thought I knew Marcus. I thought I knew Kayla better than I knew almost anyone in the world. What I had was an intimate relationship with the portions of them they decided I should have access to, and those portions were real. I don't want to say the whole thing was fake because that would make the grief simpler than it actually is, but they were partial, and partial is not the same as whole, and I had been treating partial as whole for years and paying the price of that confusion without
I'm not
knowing I
in a
was paying
relationship
it.
right now, and I'm not particularly trying to be. I've had some therapy, the kind where you actually say the uncomfortable things out loud to someone qualified to receive them, rather than just turning them over in your own head, and I'd recommend it to anyone who thinks they don't need it, because that's usually the person who needs it most. I live in the house I kept, with the repainted bedroom and the rearranged furniture, and most days it feels like mine now, in a way it didn't for a while, and some days it still feels like a place where something happened, and I'm just living inside the afterward. Both of those things are true on different mornings. I've been spending more time with Dana, who has continued to be excellent, and with a few other people I'd let drift during the marriage, in the way you sometimes let friendships drift when your life fills up with a person, and you don't notice the drift until the person is gone. I'm filling in the gaps. I'm remembering who I was before the architecture of that relationship became the shape I oriented everything else around. It's slow, and it's not always comfortable, and some days it feels like genuine progress, and other days it just feels like living, which I've come to think is probably enough. If there's a thing I'd want someone to take from this, not a lesson exactly, because I'm skeptical of people who extract clean lessons from messy situations, but a thing, it would be about the relationship between trust and information. I trusted Kayla and Marcus not because I had evidence they were trustworthy, but because I loved them, and loving someone carries with it a default assumption of safety that isn't always earned and isn't always warranted. I conflated being known with being safe. I thought the intimacy I felt with them was mutual, that because I was giving them access to the full, complicated version of myself, they were doing the same in return. But intimacy isn't always symmetrical. People can receive everything you offer and give back a carefully edited version, and you can't always tell the difference from the inside. You trust people until you have a reason not to, and that's not naivety. That's just how relationships work. The alternative is a life where you trust no one and protect everything, and that's its own kind of devastation. What I've adjusted is not my capacity to trust, but my willingness to ignore my own discomfort when something small doesn't add up. Because looking back, there were moments where something small didn't add up, and I talked myself out of paying attention to it, partly because I was busy, and partly because the person I would have talked it through with was one of the people causing it. The discomfort was real. I just had no system for taking it seriously without her help. I have a better system now. I'm still the person who picked up soup on a Sunday afternoon because her husband said he wasn't feeling well. I'm still the person who wanted to take care of someone she loved. That part of me didn't go anywhere, and I don't want it to, because the instinct to show up for people is not the thing that hurt me. The people I showed up for are the thing that hurt me, and those are not the same problem with the same solution. The solution to the first is to trust more carefully, to pay attention, to take your own discomfort seriously. The solution to the second is to understand that you cannot control what other people choose to do with the love you give them. You can only control whether you keep giving it to people who've demonstrated they don't deserve it. I stopped giving it to 2 people. I've been more careful about who I start giving it to. And I'm still here, in my house, with my repainted walls and my rearranged furniture, and my friend Dana and my parents who love me, and the long, slow work of being a person who got broken and is figuring out, one ordinary day at a time, what she wants to be built into next. That's not a perfect ending, but it's a real one. And real is the only kind I have left to offer. And at this point in my life, I think that's actually enough.